What I thought we might do today is play a little game.
A game?
Yeah, called Cancel the Founder. We could go through the list of, our founding fathers, and you can tell me whether or not we should cancel them. It might be a fun way to start out to see how many of these founding fathers need to be canceled, whether or not you would tear down a monument.
That's
founding fathers. The other way to think of this game is, can we get Harvey Kaye canceled? Starting off at the top, it's George Washington.
Yeah, that's a good one. Okay.
Father of our country.
Okay. George Washington seems a likely candidate, and people are eager to do it because of his slave ownership and also because of the way he treated slaves. But there are questions we should ask before we tear it down too quickly. The monument. One of them is the fact that most of the slaves were his wives, and he actually didn't have any control over them. Also in his favor, of course, which doesn't absolve him by any means, but also in his favor is that it was the guy of the founders who owned slaves who placed in his will the fact that his slaves should be liberated. But on the other hand, it's also the case that when slaves of his ran away, he made significant efforts to go and reclaim them. So in terms of slavery, he probably ought to come down, though I sometimes fantasize an alternative way of doing it. Like, how about placing alongside of it the actual story that comes with it, okay? The story of Washington, who was prepared to raise up an army and go fight the British in the name of avoiding slavery for Americans. Or how about the Washington who actually was a little more open to questions of class and race than at first it may seem? Because as general, his first inclination may well have been when he arrived in New England with his Virginia soldiers and found that the New England soldiers, actually the militia, included African Americans and Native Americans and people of various mixed race combinations, is that, in fact, he responded to his own men's, the men of New England who were not keen on seeing any of their comrades dismissed from the services. And apparently he turned his back on the problem rather than follow the orders of a Congress that would have had him quickly segregate not just segregate, but turn the military into an all-white force. It's also the case that whatever his reservations were about turning the rebellion that he was so deeply embedded in, involved in, into a revolution, when his men embraced the idea of a revolution for independence and democracy, he realized it was time to move on that. On the other hand, late in his political career, as opposed to revolutionary career, he was prepared to crush rebellion in Pennsylvania. So, yeah, I mean, I can understand tearing it down. I can understand the anger of people. I have no reservations about that. Though it would also seem a shame not to have gone through the full story and the full details of George Washington. All
right. So the next one is Alexander Hamilton.
Alexander Hamilton, in his favor, to his credit, was not a slaveholder, and in fact was one of the early, somewhat of, I don't know if the word abolitionist. Yeah, he was somewhat of an abolitionist. On the other hand, Alexander Hamilton was prepared. It was his determination to create an America not unlike Britain. He wanted an America with a strong merchant capitalist class to cultivate and develop the economy. He was more than prepared, basically, it seems, to rip off veterans of the Revolution and others in order to secure monies into that capitalist class's own hands. So I've had no affection for Alexander Hamilton, frankly, in my life. Whether I tear down a monument or not, I can't say, but I could tell you that I definitely would not build one.
Benjamin Franklin.
Yes. Franklin did own a slave, but to Franklin's credit, he really did have an artisan's view of the world. He became a celebrity and famous, and and by the way, he was, and notice how I'm putting everything in Paineite terms, he was, by his own terms, the adoptive political father of Thomas Paine. He was the one who encouraged Thomas Paine to leave England in 1774 and come to America, perhaps with the idea that Paine might play a role in helping to turn the rebellion into a revolution. So I would not tear down a statue of Benjamin Franklin.
Okay. And did he invent electricity?
Did he invent electricity? Did he discover it? I don't know, but he was the most famous person in the Atlantic world during his life, in good part because he was an inventor and something of a radical, and he had a clever way with words.
John Adams.
Oh, geez, Adams. You know what? Adams does not deserve to have a statue of him taken down. But neither should he get a statue on the National Mall before Thomas Paine. Let me make that clear. John Adams had no affection whatsoever. He just, in fact, in some ways, he hated aristocracy. The problem with Adams is that he also had no trust in the common people. So, in other words, he cared little for monarchy, but he cared little for democracy.
He's a misanthrope.
Indeed. And he really, his goal would have been to create a republic governed by elites, not necessarily an hereditary elite, so not an aristocracy, nevertheless an elite. And he had this very strange, at first, response to Thomas Paine. So on the one hand, Adams loved the fact that Thomas Paine called for independence. He loved it, okay? But he was really, really disturbed, in fact, fretful, that Thomas Paine was unleashing working people in the revolution, that he was building up in their minds the idea that we actually might create a democratic republic. And there's this famous exchange of letters, which quite often isn't told in full, between John Adams and Abigail Adams. So John Adams bought 3 copies of Thomas Paine's Common Sense when it appeared in early January of 1776. He kept one for himself, which he read, and he sent 2 up to Abigail Adams in Quincy, near Boston. And she was to deliver one of those copies to someone else. She read it, but in those days, the mail, the post was rather slow, and their letters were crossing. John wrote to Abigail asking her, "What do you think of this Common Sense?" And Abigail wrote back as these things crossed and said, "I'm charmed by the sentiments." As I sometimes tell people, it kind of excited her. So Paine's pain excited her. And she sort of implied that he had written, not Paine, but Adams himself had written this. And Adams ends up writing back and he says, "No, I could never have written in such a manly fashion." By the way, the beauty of knowing John Adams, if you could bring him back to life, is it would be like being the fly on the wall in a therapist's office. More than any other man of his time, John Adams spoke his mind, his animosities, his jealousies, his self-doubts. I mean, it was really quite an amazing character for his day. But again, he actually thought that Paine was only good at destroying things, not building them up. And the reason he said that, we know that the reason he would have said that is that Thomas Paine, in Common Sense, offered a model of what an American Constitution might look like, and it was highly democratic and very revolutionary in spirit, including the idea of a Bill of Rights, which would guarantee freedom of conscience. And John Adams was so upset by the democratic vision that Paine offered that he wrote a response to it. And the response was to offer the vision of a constitution modeled not unlike the English, where there would be 2 chambers, a Senate and a House of Representatives. Mm-hmm. Paine wanted a single assembly because he had confidence that people would choose good representatives. Only very late in life did Paine change his mind that maybe two would be good just as a way of checking each other, mm-hmm. in case something got through too quickly. So anyhow, Adams over and over again through the rest of his life had little good to say about Thomas Paine. He actually called Common Sense, which turned the rebellion into revolution, a crapulous mass, as he put it. He wrote in letters to Jefferson that he feared the idea that the revolution would be accorded to only Washington or to Paine or to Franklin, that in fact he himself might be left out of the story of the revolution. So, with Adams, I don't know if I tear one down, but there again, no place for him on the National Mall until we do that for Thomas Paine.
All right, fair enough. Okay, so we've done John Adams. Now it's time for Samuel Adams.
Samuel Adams. He was a real firebrand, Samuel Adams. He played a really significant role in the rebellion, you might say. In fact, that's when he's most significant. He was the one who really helps to ignite the furor that the common people of Boston, that artisans and others had. So, I mean, really, we really would want to capture that kind of spirit, and probably a monument to Sam Adams would be okay. The only thing that always bugged me about Sam Adams is later, after the Revolution, after the Constitution, when Thomas Paine writes The Age of Reason, which is his critique of organized religion and his call for freedom of thought and conscience, to the point of saying that we really do have to understand that we don't need priests or ministers or any religious authorities to tell us what to believe any more than we need aristocrats and kings to tell us what to, who to worship or who to praise in our political lives. And Samuel Adams, was very upset that his friend Thomas Paine, his fellow revolutionary, his fellow radical, would criticize religion in the way he did. So, that's the only thing I might hold against Sam Adams, that he wasn't more of a free thinker.
Here's one that people are really debating. Thomas Jefferson.
Oh, this is always a tough one for anyone who's a radical Democrat. So let's consider Thomas Jefferson. On the one hand, here's Jefferson, who writes so beautifully in the Declaration of Independence: all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And he really does believe fundamentally that, we're all human beings. But he's got running through him, I haven't even mentioned the slaveholding yet, he has this racialist understanding of humanity, that whites and blacks have really fundamentally different, if you like, abilities and intellectual capacities. In fact, he's dismissive of African Americans in terms of creativity, which is kind of bizarre when you think about just how creative Black culture has been.
Yeah, well, I would say Black culture is more than half of American culture.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. But okay. The other thing is that he's a slaveholder. Now, he hated slavery, hated it, and was probably he would have loved to have seen not only the end of the slave trade, but the end of slavery, but just couldn't bring himself to give up his own slaves. Okay. I mean, he held firmly to it. And at the very same time, by most historical and now genealogical accounts, he actually ends up in this long-time affair with Sally Hemings. Okay. And then to add to the curiosity of the whole thing is that Sally Hemings is the half-sister of his late wife, because it was his late wife's father who was also the father of Sally Hemings. And with Sally Hemings, there are children. And you could well have imagined that during his lifetime, he could see his way to the fact that if he could love a Black woman, then surely equality would call upon him to bring an end to slavery on his own estate.
Yeah, my understanding is that that his that his relationship with that after his wife died, she sort of replaced his wife.
Right. And in fact, this is the interesting thing. So there's a historian whose name I'll never get right. She's an American, teaches at the University of Connecticut, I believe, at Storrs. She did a great book on the abolitionists, titled, I'm pretty sure, The Abolitionists. And she was interviewed on this question, and I'm sure Jefferson was the one she was thinking of most. And she said that, take down the monuments to the Confederates unreservedly. Take down the monuments to racists, clearly. But she wasn't sure about the monuments to the likes of Washington and Jefferson, because she said, think about the fact that Washington and Jefferson, especially in the case of Jefferson, literally wrote a document that becomes the most powerful document for the abolitionist movement. And in fact, during the revolution itself, the group that most embraced Thomas Jefferson's words were African Americans in New England, who were going to petition for certain rights, and petition for the rights. Well, even for slaves petitioned the courts for their freedom during the revolution based on Jefferson's words. So in some ways, she worried that if we were to tear down these monuments to Jefferson and erase his words in some fashion, we would lose that fundamentally radical ideal that has empowered so many generations to lay claim to the promise of not just Jefferson, but of Thomas Paine and Jefferson and the better members of the founding generation. So, people may resent me for saying this, but I would be careful about which Jefferson monuments we tear down.
I would think that maybe you would go so far to say, yeah, don't tear down the monuments to Thomas Jefferson.
Yeah, just make, one thing one thing I can say is that wherever these monuments might be, surely we are creative enough, I would imagine, to find better ways of explaining Americans' history so that the story of exploitation and oppression and tragedy and irony gets told. But yeah, when I have this real ambivalence about Jefferson, but there's a fundamental element of Jefferson, and that is those words in the Declaration. Okay,
James Madison.
there again, one of those guys, right? I mean, Madison's significant. And Madison's importance is this: if he had only been involved in the Constitution and having been a slaveholder, hell with him, right? Hell with him. But the fact is, he came to see the imperative, in part educated by the likes of Jefferson and Paine. He came to see the imperative of a Bill of Rights. And in that sense, maybe he gets look, nobody gets redeemed as a slaveholder. Shit, but it is the case that his place in American history should by no means be merely the fact that he was one of those slaveholders, but his role in authoring the Bill of Rights and that First Amendment, absolutely powerful. Okay, freedom of conscience, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom to assemble, and the right to petition. Those are powerful rights which prevailed nowhere else in the world, and we should never underestimate the value that has played. And by the way, as long as we're talking about it this week, the Supreme Court decided today in a most unconstitutional fashion, in a betrayal of the founders and the framers, that public dollars could go to underwriting scholarships at religious schools, and that is a breach in the wall of separation between church and state. And by the way, that's another thing to be thankful to certain members of the founders who might have held slaves, is that they made the revolution revolutionary because of the question of separating church and state. Profound revolutionary act. And today, it's just terrible as we record this. It's in my mind. I'm really off.
Yeah. Okay, we've got two more. John Jay.
I don't want to go on too much about John Jay because I think of him in terms of the Federalist period, and he was clearly on the wrong side between Federalists and Republicans. How's that? Okay.
And now finally, Thomas Paine.
Now we're talking. The problem is that Thomas Paine doesn't have the monuments to be turned.
Should we build one and then tear it down?
No. Look, there's a monument to Paine in Paris because he was the author of Rights of Man. There's a monument to him in Thetford, England, the town where he was born, and it was put up by American servicemen during World War II, bomber pilots who were, involved in the liberation of Europe from Hitler. In this country, there's a monument in Morristown, New Jersey, which is an absolutely beautiful monument, which records Paine's writing of The Crisis, not Common Sense, but The Crisis paper. In December of 1776, the famous words, "These are the times that try men's souls." These were the words that ended up saving the revolution. These were the words that Washington had read to his men before they got back into the boat to go back across the Delaware to fight the Battle of Trenton and beat the shit out of the Hessians there in Trenton, and thus be able to sustain the revolution. There's another monument to him, just a small statue to him in I'm forgetting the town, Bloomfield, New Jersey. No, Burlington, New Jersey. It's down across the way from Philadelphia, which is a really nice little monument. And then there is a monument going up in Fort Lee, New Jersey, that I've been the advisor to, because in Fort Lee, New Jersey, as you look across the Hudson, you see Manhattan, and that was where Thomas Paine was with Nathaniel Greene's troops and saw Washington losing battle after battle in New York. And then Washington came across the river with what remained of his army, and they thus began the retreat across New Jersey. This is where Washington and Paine first meet, and it's there that Washington asks Paine to write again that famous pamphlet, The Crisis. So what we really need, I'll tell you a quick story. I don't know if we're running out of time, but
no, we're not. We got time.
Okay. So it took generations of American struggles, and every generation of American history, the powerful, the property, and the prestigious, they wanted to suppress Paine's memory. They just wanted to wipe him off out of the American story because he was so radical in terms of politics and in terms of religion, and also in terms, this worried them too. He wrote a pamphlet in the late 1790s titled Agrarian Justice. And in that, he called for the taxation of the landed rich to create a fund that would be used for two purposes. On the one hand, every young person on reaching the age of maturity, the age, say, of 21 at that time, would have received a grant of money that they could use for land or education or business, basically to prevent them from falling into poverty. And to his credit, he was a feminist. He wanted that money to go to both young men and young women. That's very radical in his thinking. Maybe because he had been friends with Mary Wollstonecraft during the French Revolutionary years, the mother of modern feminism. Then also, the other part of the fund would be used,
and the mother of Mary Shelley, author of Frankenstein.
Yes, right. She had Godwin was her partner, and Godwin was, to some people, the modern father of anarchism, for what that's worth.
Right.
Okay? And I'm not dismissing anarchism. I meant
I will do it for you. I'm dismissing anarchism.
Okay.
Just because it makes all of my viewers so mad. I love to get them.
Oh, good. I don't want to piss off
commenting.
Okay. So then, but here's the other thing. So the other part of the fund would be used to underwrite what we would call Social Security today. He was the godfather, even online, unless the Trump people have taken his name off the story. Thomas Paine is the one who actually first envisioned social security and social democracy. He is the pioneering social democrat. So for any number of good reasons, Paine should have a monument in Washington. Somebody once said, and I subscribe to it, Paine should have a monument in every city of America, in every town of America. And then someone else said, well, maybe he doesn't need a monument. His words remain his monument. Okay. And let's not forget, it was in Common Sense that Thomas Paine wrote, "We have it in our power to begin the world over again." I mean, that's both fundamentally true and fundamentally questionable. But the fundamental truth of it is that we live in a socially created world. And in that sense, we have it in our power to begin the world over again. And by the way, I mean, that's a fundamental idea to Marxist thought as well. Okay?
It is. Thanks for watching this Zer0 Books video. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to this channel and click on the notifications bell so that you'll be alerted whenever we release a new video. You should also consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons get access to our Inside Zer0 Books podcast every week and can get access to the Zer0 Books book club and help us to continue making online content from the left.